The sun hung like a merciless eye above the New Mexico territory, its heat shimmering off the red rocks and sparse brush that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Thomas McKenna wiped the sweat from his brow with a calloused hand, his weathered face squinting against the glare as he guided his pack mule through the narrow canyon. The silence was complete except for the soft shuffle of hooves on stone and the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. Thomas had been traveling for 3 days, following an old Apache trail that wound through the Badlands between Santa Fe and the trading post at Copper Creek. His saddlebags carried supplies for the isolated settlement: salt, ammunition, and a small pouch of silver dollars that represented 2 months of careful saving. At 42, he had learned to read the desert like other men read books, understanding its moods and dangers with the instinct of someone who had survived 15 years in this unforgiving land. The canyon walls rose on either side, carved smooth by centuries of flash floods and wind. Ancient petroglyphs decorated the stone faces, telling stories of hunts and ceremonies from times when this land knew different footsteps. Thomas respected these markings, understanding that he was a guest in a place that had belonged to others long before any white man had seen it. His mule suddenly stopped, ears pricked forward and nostrils flaring. Thomas reached for the rifle across his saddle, his eyes scanning the rocks ahead for any sign of movement. Mountain lions sometimes use these canyons as hunting grounds, and a desperate cat could spell death for both man and beast in these narrow confines. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it entirely. A soft whimpering, barely audible above the whisper of wind through stone. Thomas dismounted carefully, his boots silent on the sandy floor of the canyon. The sound came again, weaker this time, from somewhere among the tumbled boulders at the base of the north wall. Moving closer, Thomas saw a splash of color that did not belong to the natural palette of the desert. A small figure lay partially hidden in the shadow of a large rock, dressed in what had once been beautifully decorated clothing. As he approached, Thomas realized with a start that it was a child, an Apache boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, lying motionless, except for the slight rise and fall of his chest. The boy's condition was grave. His lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, his small face gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. The traditional clothing he wore, a breechcloth and small moccasins decorated with intricate beadwork, spoke of a family that had cared for him well before whatever disaster had brought him to this place. But now, the fine leather was torn and stained, and one moccasin was missing entirely. Thomas knelt beside the child, his rough hands gentle as he checked for injuries. The boy's breathing was shallow but steady, and his pulse, though weak, seemed regular. There were no obvious wounds, but his body felt fragile as a bird's beneath the deerskin clothing. How long had he been here? How had he become separated from his people? Lifting the child carefully, Thomas was struck by how light he was, far too light for a healthy boy his age. The Apache were known for their strength and endurance, even in children, but this little one had been pushed beyond the limits of what any human body could endure. His dark hair was matted with dust and sand, and his small hands were scratched raw, probably from trying to find shelter among the rocks. Thomas carried the boy to where his mule waited patiently, the animal's dark eyes seeming to understand the gravity of the situation. With practiced efficiency, he arranged his bedroll to create a soft nest in the shade of an overhanging rock face. The temperature in the direct sunlight was approaching 110 degrees, but here in the shadow, it was perhaps 20 degrees cooler. Still brutally hot, but survivable. Water was the first priority. Thomas had filled his canteens at a reliable spring 12 miles back, and he blessed his habit of carrying more water than he thought he would need. The boy's lips were so dry they had begun to crack and bleed, and Thomas knew he had to be careful not to give too much too quickly. A person dying of thirst could drown from drinking too fast. Using his dampened bandana, Thomas wet the boy's lips carefully, letting tiny drops of water seep into his mouth. The child stirred slightly at the touch of moisture, his tongue moving reflexively to gather every precious drop. Gradually, Thomas was able to get the boy to take small sips, holding his head gently to prevent choking. As the water began to revive him, the child's eyes fluttered open. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with a wariness that no child should possess. For a moment, the boy stared at Thomas with complete stillness, his gaze taking in the white man's weathered face, his dusty clothes, and the rifle that lay within easy reach. Thomas spoke softly in the few Apache words he knew, picked up from traders and friendly encounters over the years. His pronunciation was clumsy, but the meaning was clear. Friend, help, safe. The boy's eyes never left his face, and Thomas could see the child's mind working despite his weakened state, evaluating this stranger who had found him in his hour of greatest need. Over the next several hours, as the sun tracked across the narrow strip of sky visible between the canyon walls, Thomas worked to bring the boy back from the edge of death. He offered tiny pieces of jerky softened with water, watching carefully to see that the child's stomach could handle food after what might have been days without eating. He used his spare shirt to create a more comfortable bed and positioned his body to provide additional shade as the angle of the sun changed. The boy was clearly intelligent and observant. Even in his weakened state, his eyes followed Thomas's every movement, noting how the white man handled his weapons, how he moved around the camp, how he rationed the precious water. Thomas recognized this behavior. The child was learning, storing information that might mean the difference between life and death. As evening approached and the brutal heat began to ease slightly, the boy was able to sit up with support. Thomas offered him more water and small bites of hardtack soaked until it was soft enough to chew easily. The child ate slowly, his small hands shaking with weakness, but his appetite was encouraging. His body was beginning to remember how to live. That night, Thomas built a small fire in a sheltered spot where the flames would not be visible from the canyon rim. The desert grew cold quickly after dark, and the boy's thin body had no reserves left to fight the chill. Thomas wrapped him in his own blanket and sat close enough that his body heat would provide additional warmth. The child slept fitfully, sometimes crying out words in Apache that Thomas did not understand. In those moments, Thomas would speak quietly in English, his voice low and reassuring, until the boy settled back into sleep. Whatever had happened to bring the child here alone had left deep marks on his young spirit. By morning, the improvement was remarkable. The boy was able to drink longer and deeper, and his eyes had regained some of their natural alertness. Thomas prepared a thin gruel from cornmeal and water, seasoning it with a pinch of salt to help replace what the child's body had lost through dehydration. The boy ate hungrily, his small face showing the first hint of hope since Thomas had found him. As the sun climbed higher and the day's heat began to build, Thomas faced a difficult decision. The boy was still far too weak to travel, but staying in the canyon much longer would deplete Thomas's water supplies to a dangerous level. The nearest reliable water source was 8 miles ahead, a journey that would take most of a day with the child in his current condition. Thomas decided to risk it. He fashioned a carrier from his bedroll and rope, creating a secure seat where the boy could ride on the mule's back without effort. The child watched these preparations with interest, his quick mind understanding that they were preparing to leave this place that had nearly become his grave. The journey was slow and careful. Thomas walked alongside the mule, one hand always ready to steady the boy if he showed signs of weakness. They rested frequently in whatever shade they could find, and Thomas monitored the child's condition constantly. The boy bore the discomfort without complaint, showing the stoic endurance that was characteristic of his people. By late afternoon, they reached the spring Thomas had been seeking, a small oasis where water seeped from the rocks to form a shallow pool surrounded by cottonwood trees. The sight of abundant water and green leaves seemed to revive the boy's spirits remarkably. For the first time since Thomas had found him, the child smiled. That evening, camped beside the spring with water and shade in abundance, the boy spoke his first words. His voice was still hoarse from his ordeal, but the words were clear. "Thank you." He had said them in English, and Thomas realized the child understood far more of his language than he had initially thought. "What is your name?" Thomas asked gently, using simple words and gestures to make his meaning clear. The boy hesitated for a long moment, then replied, "Nalnish." He pointed to himself, then to Thomas, his eyebrows raised in question. "Thomas," came the reply, and the man pointed to his own chest. "Thomas McKenna." Nalnish nodded solemnly, as if sealing an agreement between them. In the firelight, Thomas could see that the boy's face had already begun to fill out slightly, losing some of the gaunt look that had marked his near starvation. The resilience of youth was working its miracle, aided by consistent food, water, and safety. Over the next 2 days, as they remained camped by the spring, Nalnish grew stronger. His appetite returned with a vengeance, and he showed a keen interest in everything Thomas did. The boy watched intently as Thomas maintained his equipment, prepared food, and cared for the mule. It was clear that he was learning, absorbing knowledge that might serve him well in the future. Thomas found himself oddly moved by the child's quiet dignity. Despite his ordeal, Nalnish never complained or demanded anything. He offered to help with small tasks around the camp, and his face lit up with pride when Thomas allowed him to gather firewood or help with simple cooking chores. There was something ancient and noble in the boy's bearing, a quality that reminded Thomas why the Apache had earned the respect of everyone who encountered them, whether as friends or enemies. On the third morning, as Thomas was preparing to continue toward Copper Creek, he noticed that Nalnish was staring intently toward the southwest, his young face troubled. When Thomas asked what was wrong, the boy simply shook his head and continued to gaze in that direction, as if listening for something only he could hear. "Your family?" Thomas asked gently, pointing in the direction of the boy's gaze. Nalnish nodded slowly, then spoke in halting English. "They look for me." "Long time looking." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. If Apache searchers were in the area, his presence with the boy might be misunderstood. Apache warriors protecting their own had little patience for explanations, especially from white men found with their children. But the thought of abandoning the boy now, when he was still so vulnerable, was unthinkable. "Are they close?" Thomas asked. The boy tilted his head, listening to sounds Thomas could not hear. "3 days," he said finally. "Maybe 4. Thomas made his decision quickly. They would continue to Copper Creek, but slowly, giving Nalnish time to grow stronger while putting some distance between themselves and any pursuing Apache. If the boy's people caught up to them, Thomas would trust to the evidence of Nalnish's improved condition and the boy's own testimony to protect them both. As they prepared to leave the spring, Thomas caught Nalnish looking at him with an expression that seemed far too mature for such a young face. The boy approached and, with grave formality, placed his small hand on Thomas's arm. "You saved my life," Nalnish said in careful English. "My people will remember." Thomas felt a tightness in his throat that he could not explain. "Any decent person would have done the same," he replied, but he could see in the boy's eyes that Nalnish understood the truth, that many would not have stopped, would not have risked their own safety and supplies for a child of another race. They traveled steadily through the morning, following the old trail that wound between stands of juniper and piñon pine. The landscape gradually changed as they climbed toward higher elevations. the red rock giving way to gray stone and patches of actual grass. Nalnish rode easily now, his strength returning with each passing hour. At midday they stopped to rest in the shade of a towering ponderosa pine. Thomas was checking the mule's pack when Nalnish suddenly stiffened, his head turning toward the trail behind them. Thomas reached for his rifle, but the boy shook his head quickly. "Not danger," Nalnish said softly. "My people, they come." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. "How do you know?" The boy pointed to the sky, where Thomas could now see 3 thin columns of smoke rising in the distance, signals that meant nothing to him but obviously carried clear meaning for Nalnish. "They say they found my trail. They know I live." The boy paused, then added quietly, "They know I am with white man." The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. Apache war parties moved fast and struck without warning. If they believed he had harmed the boy or taken him captive, there would be no opportunity for explanation. He would be dead before he could speak a word in his own defense. But looking at Nalnish, seeing the trust in the boy's dark eyes, Thomas knew he could not run. The child was still not strong enough for hard travel, and abandoning him now would undo all the progress they had made. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Thomas made camp in a sheltered meadow where they could be approached from any direction without ambush. He built his fire in the open and kept his weapons visible but not threatening. If Apache warriors were coming, he wanted them to see clearly that he was not hiding anything. Nalnish seemed to sense his anxiety and moved closer to Thomas as they sat by the fire. "You are a good man," the boy said simply. "My grandmother will see this. She understands the heart." "Your grandmother?" Nalnish nodded solemnly. "She leads the searchers. She is, how do you say, medicine woman. She knows things other people do not know." Thomas found little comfort in this revelation. In his experience, medicine people could be the most dangerous of all when they believed their spiritual authority was threatened. A grandmother seeking her lost grandson might be even more fierce than any warrior. As darkness fell and the fire burned low, Thomas lay awake listening to every sound the night made. Nalnish slept peacefully beside him, the boy's breathing deep and regular, showing no signs of the trauma he had endured. Whatever was coming, the child faced it with the calm acceptance of his people. Just before dawn, Thomas heard it, the soft sound of unshod hooves on grass, moving with the careful deliberation of riders who could approach unseen if they chose. He sat up slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle, then stopping as he remembered Nalnish's words. These were not enemies coming to kill, but family members coming to reclaim one of their own. Nalnish stirred and opened his eyes, immediately alert. He listened for a moment, then smiled, the first completely carefree expression Thomas had seen on his face. "They are here," the boy whispered, and Thomas heard in his voice a joy and relief that spoke of a love deeper than words could express. The first rider appeared at the edge of the meadow as the eastern sky began to lighten, followed by 2 others. They sat their horses without moving, 3 dark silhouettes against the gray morning, and Thomas knew that his fate, and perhaps his life, hung in the balance of the next few minutes. The 3 riders remained motionless at the edge of the meadow, their presence as solid and immovable as the stone formations that dotted the landscape. Thomas could feel their eyes upon him, weighing and measuring, reading the story written in the camp's arrangement, the boy's obvious health, and his own careful posture that showed respect without submission. Nalnish rose to his feet with a fluid motion that reminded Thomas how much the boy had recovered in their time together. The child raised his hand in greeting and called out words in Apache, his young voice carrying across the morning stillness with clear joy and reverence. The response came immediately, a woman's voice, rich with emotion that transcended language barriers. The center rider dismounted first, moving with the economical grace of someone accustomed to reading danger in every situation. She was perhaps 60 years old, her gray-streaked hair bound with intricate silver ornaments that caught the early light. Her clothing was traditional but beautifully made, a deerskin dress decorated with patterns that seemed to tell stories, and moccasins that showed the fine craftsmanship of a master artisan. But it was her face that commanded attention. Weathered by decades of desert sun and hardship, yet filled with an intelligence and authority that needed no explanation. The two younger women flanked her like silent guardians. One appeared to be in her 30s, her hand resting casually on the handle of a knife at her belt, her dark eyes never leaving Thomas's face. The other was younger, perhaps 25, and Thomas noticed the striking resemblance between her features and Nalnish's. Mother or aunt, he guessed, someone whose world had been torn apart by the boy's disappearance. Nalnish ran toward the older woman with the unburdened joy of a child reunited with beloved family. She caught him in her arms, and for a moment her carefully controlled expression cracked to reveal the depth of her relief. She held him close, her weathered hands checking for injuries with the practiced touch of someone who had tended the wounded many times before. She spoke to him in rapid Apache, her questions punctuated by gentle touches and careful examinations. Thomas understood nothing of the words, but the meaning was universal. A grandmother confirming that her grandson was truly safe and whole. Nalnish answered eagerly, gesturing toward Thomas several times, his young voice animated as he told his story. The older woman listened intently, her expression growing more thoughtful with each word the boy spoke. Finally, she looked up at Thomas, and he found himself the subject of a gaze that seemed to see directly into his soul. She spoke a single word in English, her accent thick but the meaning clear. "Come." Thomas approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, stopping at a respectful distance. The woman studied him for long moments, taking in his weathered face, his practical clothing, the careful way he moved that spoke of a man comfortable in dangerous places but not seeking conflict. Her eyes lingered on his hands, calloused and scarred from hard work, but gentle when he had tended her grandson. "I am Maria Santos," she said finally, her English heavily accented but precise. "This boy is blood of my blood. You found him?" "3 days ago," Thomas replied simply, "in Devil's Canyon, near death from thirst and hunger." Her eyes sharpened. "Devil's Canyon? 20 miles from here. How does a boy travel so far alone?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. He was unconscious when I found him. Too weak to tell me anything for the first day." Maria Santos turned to Nalnish and spoke in Apache. The boy's response was long and detailed, his small hands gesturing as he recounted his ordeal. Thomas caught familiar words, his own name, references to water and food, and what sounded like expressions of gratitude. The younger woman who resembled Nalnish stepped forward. "I am Elena, his mother," she said, her English more fluent than Maria's. "He tells us you shared your water when your own supply was dangerous low. You gave him your blanket. You carried him to safety." Her voice carried a mixture of gratitude and suspicion that Thomas understood completely. "Any decent person would have done the same." Thomas repeated the words he had spoken to Nalnish, meaning them just as deeply. Elena's eyes flashed. "No, not any person. We know what most of your people think of Apache children found alone in the desert." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a green fire. Thomas had no answer because he knew she spoke the truth. Many white settlers viewed Apache children as future warriors to be eliminated, or at best, as burdens to be avoided. The fact that he had not thought that way did not erase the reality of what others had done. Maria Santos raised a weathered hand, and Elena fell silent. The old woman approached Thomas, moving closer than social convention usually allowed, studying his face with the intensity of someone reading sacred signs. She reached out and took his hands in hers, turning them palm up, examining the calluses and scars with the attention of a palm reader. "You work with your hands," she observed. "Build things, fix things." "Yes, I'm a carpenter and sometimes a blacksmith. Good trades, honest trades." She released his hands but continued to study his face. "Nalnish says you knew Apache words. Where did you learn?" "From traders, from peaceful meetings over the years. I always thought it wise to know at least a few words of the languages spoken by people who know this land better than I do." Something flickered in Maria's eyes that might have been approval. "Most white men think Apache words are not worth learning." "Most white men are fools," Thomas replied bluntly, then immediately wondered if his honesty had been a mistake. But Maria Santos smiled for the first time since arriving, transforming her stern features entirely. "Yes, they are." She spoke rapidly to Elena and the third woman, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Thomas caught the repeated sound of his name and what seemed to be detailed instructions. Elena nodded reluctantly. "My mother says we will make camp here today. She wishes to speak with you more, to understand your heart." The third woman was introduced as Carmen, Elena's sister, and a skilled tracker who had followed Nalnish's faint trail across 20 miles of challenging terrain. She spoke little English but communicated volumes with her expressive eyes and precise gestures. It was clear that she had been the one to locate the boy's path and guide the rescue party to this place. As the women established their camp, Thomas observed the efficiency and skill with which they worked. Their horses were magnificent animals, clearly bred for speed and endurance, and their equipment showed the same careful craftsmanship evident in their clothing. These were not the primitive nomads depicted in sensational newspaper stories, but sophisticated people with a deep understanding of their environment and their craft. Maria Santos separated a portion of dried meat and cornmeal from their supplies and presented it to Thomas with formal dignity. "You shared your food with my grandson. We share ours with you." The gesture carried weight beyond simple hospitality. Thomas understood that he was being accepted, temporarily at least, as a guest deserving of protection and respect. But he also sensed that this acceptance came with obligations and expectations he did not yet understand. Nalnish moved freely between the two camps, chattering happily in both English and Apache, clearly delighted to serve as translator and intermediary. His recovery was remarkable. In just a few days, he had transformed from a dying child to a lively boy whose eyes sparkled with curiosity and mischief. But Thomas noticed that the women watched the child constantly, as if unable to believe he was truly safe. As the day progressed, Maria Santos drew Thomas into conversation, asking questions that seemed casual but clearly served a deeper purpose. She wanted to know about his family, his travels, his reasons for being in this remote country. Thomas answered honestly, describing his modest ambitions to establish a workshop in Copper Creek, his lack of close family, and his appreciation for the stark beauty of the desert landscape. "You travel alone," Maria observed. "This is dangerous country for a man without companions." "I'm careful, and I've learned to read the signs that tell when danger is near." "What signs told you to stop for a dying Apache child? Most men in dangerous country would ride faster, not slower." The question struck to the heart of something Thomas had not fully examined himself. "I heard him crying," he said finally. "Once I heard it, I couldn't ride past." Maria studied his face intently. "Even knowing he was Apache? Even knowing his people might not understand your intentions?" Thomas met her gaze steadily. A dying child is a dying child. Nothing else matters when you hear that sound. Elena, who had been listening while tending her son, looked up sharply. "You have children of your own?" "No," Thomas replied quietly. "I've never married." "Then how do you know the sound of a child in mortal need?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, remembering. "During the war, I saw too many children separated from their families. I learned to recognize the sound of desperation." The women exchanged glances that carried meanings Thomas could not decipher. Carmen spoke rapidly to Maria in Apache, and the older woman nodded thoughtfully. "Carmen says the tracks around the place where you found Nalnish tell a story," Elena translated. "She sees where you knelt beside him, where you made shade, where you gave him water many times through the day and night. She says the sign shows great care, like a father caring for his own child." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I did what needed doing." "Yes," Maria said simply. "This is why we do not kill you." The blunt statement hung in the air, and Thomas realized how close he had come to death without understanding it. These women had approached prepared for violence, ready to avenge harm done to their child. Only the evidence of careful nurturing had stayed their hands. As evening approached, Maria Santos began preparations that Thomas recognized as ceremonial. She built a small fire apart from the main camp and arranged sage, tobacco, and other plants he could not identify around the flames. The scent that rose from the burning herbs was unlike anything he had experienced, earthy and clean, with undertones that seemed to clear his mind and sharpen his senses. "She performs a blessing," Elena explained quietly, "to thank the spirits for returning Nalnish safely, and to understand what this meeting means for our people and yours." Thomas watched respectfully as Maria sang in a language far older than the Apache he had heard earlier, her voice rising and falling in patterns that seemed to match the rhythm of wind through canyon rocks. Nalnish sat beside her, his young face serious and attentive, clearly understanding the importance of what was taking place. When the ceremony concluded, Maria approached Thomas with an expression that seemed to mix gratitude with deep concern. "The spirits speak clearly," she said. "They show me a man with a good heart who acted without thought of reward. But they also show me danger coming, not from you, but because of what you have done." "What kind of danger?" Maria's expression darkened. "There are bad men among your people. Men who hate Apache children even more than Apache warriors. They will not understand why you helped Nalnish. They will not forgive your kindness." Thomas felt a chill as he understood the implications. "You mean there will be trouble because I helped him?" "Yes, and not just for you. For us also." Maria sat heavily on a fallen log, suddenly looking every one of her 60 years. "There are those among my people who say no good can come from trusting any white man. When they learn that you held the boy for 3 days, they will ask questions. Ugly questions," Elena added grimly. "They will wonder if you truly found him dying, or if you had some part in his condition. They will ask why you did not bring him directly to the reservation, why you traveled toward the white settlements instead." Thomas felt the weight of a trap he had never seen being set. "What should I have done differently?" "Nothing," Maria said firmly. "You saved his life. But good actions do not always bring good consequences in this world." Carmen spoke urgently to Maria, pointing toward the western mountains where Thomas could now see thin columns of smoke rising against the darkening sky. Elena's face went pale as Maria translated. "Riders coming from the reservation," Elena said tightly. "Military escort and Indian agent. They received word that a white man was seen with an Apache child. They are coming to investigate." Thomas understood immediately. Military escorts meant soldiers who shot first and investigated later. Indian agents meant government officials whose careers depended on preventing any incident that might embarrass their superiors. Together, they represented a combination that boded ill for everyone involved. "How much time do we have?" Thomas asked. Carmen held up 4 fingers and pointed to the sun's position on the horizon. 4 hours, maybe less. Maria Santos stood and looked directly at Thomas, her expression grave. Now you must choose. You can ride away now before they arrive, disappear into the mountains and let us handle this alone. Or you can stay and face whatever comes with us. If I stay, what happens? Questions. Suspicion. Maybe arrest. Maria's voice was matter-of-fact. The agent will assume you took the boy for bad reasons. The soldiers will assume you are an Indian lover who cannot be trusted. Your reputation among the white settlements will be destroyed. And if I run? Elena answered, her voice bitter. Then my son's story becomes proof that whites cannot be trusted. That kindness from your people is always false, always selfish. That we were fools to believe otherwise. Thomas looked at Nalnish, who sat quietly by the fire, his dark eyes moving from face to face as he followed the conversation that would determine his future, and the future of any understanding between their peoples. The boy had been through too much already. He deserved better than to be abandoned again by someone he had learned to trust. I'm staying, Thomas said quietly. Maria Santos studied his face one more time, then nodded slowly. Then we prepare for battle. Not with weapons, but with truth. It will be harder to win than any fight with guns. As full darkness settled over their camp, the 4 adults began planning their strategy. They would present a united front, telling the simple truth about rescue and recovery, and hope that evidence would speak louder than prejudice. But all of them knew how rarely hope proved stronger than hatred in this harsh country. In the distance, the smoke signals continued to rise against the star-filled sky, carrying messages that would bring strangers with guns and suspicious minds to judge actions born of compassion. The night suddenly seemed very cold, and the future very uncertain. Thomas wrapped himself in his blanket and lay down near the fire, but sleep would not come. Instead, he found himself thinking about choices and consequences. About the moment when he had heard a child's cry and decided to stop rather than continue riding. That single decision had led him to this place, where good intentions might prove more dangerous than malice. Beside him, Nalnish slept peacefully, his breathing deep and regular, trusting in the protection of family and the kindness of strangers. Looking at the boy's peaceful face, Thomas knew he had made the right choice, regardless of what tomorrow might bring. Some things were worth the risk of standing up for them. But as the night wore on and the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats began to echo off the canyon walls, Thomas could not shake the feeling that the real test was yet to come. The sound of approaching horses came with the dawn, their iron shoes ringing against stone in a rhythm that spoke of military discipline and urgent purpose. Thomas woke to find the camp already stirring, the Apache women moving with the quiet efficiency of people preparing for a confrontation that could determine life or death. Maria Santos crouched beside the fire, her weathered hands steady as she prepared coffee in a battered pot. But Thomas could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the way her eyes kept drifting toward the trail where dust clouds marked the progress of the approaching riders. Elena sat close to Nalnish, one protective hand resting on her son's shoulder as she spoke to him in low, urgent Apache. "What is she telling him?" Thomas asked quietly. Carmen, who had been checking their horses, answered in her limited English. "To speak only truth. But to speak carefully. White soldiers do not always hear truth when Apache children speak it." The wisdom in those words chilled Thomas more than the morning air. He had lived on the frontier long enough to know that justice often wore different faces depending on the color of skin being judged. A white man's word carried weight that an Apache child's testimony might never achieve, regardless of its truth. The military escort crested the ridge above their camp with precision that spoke of years of frontier service. 6 cavalrymen in dusty blue uniforms, their weapons clean and ready, led by a sergeant whose eyes missed nothing as they swept over the mixed camp below. Behind them rode a civilian in a black suit that had seen better days, his pale face red with exertion and what looked like barely controlled anger. The sergeant raised his hand, and the patrol halted in perfect formation. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This is Sergeant William Hayes, United States Cavalry. We're looking for a white man traveling with an Apache child. Someone in this camp want to explain what's going on here?" Thomas stood slowly, his hands visible and empty. "I'm Thomas McKenna. I found the boy 3 days ago, dying of thirst in Devil's Canyon. I've been caring for him until his family could be located." The civilian urged his horse forward, his face flushed with suspicion and bureaucratic indignation. "I'm Agent Patterson from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Mr. McKenna, you are in violation of federal regulations regarding contact with reservation Indians. You should have brought the child directly to the proper authorities." "The nearest proper authorities were 2 days' hard ride away," Thomas replied calmly. "The boy would have died before we reached them." Agent Patterson's eyes narrowed. "That's a convenient story. How do we know you didn't take the child for your own purposes? How do we know he wasn't fine until you got your hands on him?" The accusation hit the morning air like a slap. Thomas felt his temper rise, but forced himself to remain calm. Losing control now would only confirm their suspicions and endanger everyone present. Maria Santos rose to her full height, and despite her 60 years, she commanded immediate attention. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of a woman who had negotiated with government officials for decades. "Agent Patterson, I know you. You came to reservation last year, made many promises about schools and medical care. You remember me?" Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Yes, I remember you, Maria. You're one of the tribal council members. What are you doing out here?" "Looking for my grandson. This man," she gestured toward Thomas, "found him near death and saved his life. We have spent day learning truth of what happened. There is no crime here except the crime of a good heart helping a dying child." Sergeant Hayes urged his horse closer, his experienced eyes reading the sign around the camp. "Ma'am, with respect, we need to hear the boy's account directly. These are serious accusations that have been made." Elena spoke for the first time, her English clear and precise despite her obvious anxiety. "My son will tell you exactly what happened, but he is still recovering from his ordeal. You will not frighten him with accusations against the man who saved his life." Agent Patterson's face reddened further. "Now see here, we'll conduct this investigation according to proper procedures. I won't be told how to do my job by what?" Maria Santos stepped closer to his horse, her dark eyes flashing with sudden anger. "By Apache women who know more about caring for children than any government agent? By grandmothers who tracked 20 miles through desert to find their family?" The tension in the camp ratcheted higher. Thomas could see soldiers shifting in their saddles, hands moving closer to weapons. This was exactly the kind of confrontation that could explode into violence with very little provocation. Nalnish suddenly stood and walked forward, placing himself between the mounted officials and his family. His young voice cut through the adult anger with startling clarity. "My name is Nalnish. This man found me in the canyon where I was dying. He gave me water when his own water was low. He carried me to safety. He shared his food and his blanket. He did not hurt me or frighten me. He saved my life." The boy's simple dignity silenced the adults entirely. Sergeant Hayes dismounted and knelt to the child's level, his gruff voice surprisingly gentle. "Son, can you tell me how you got to that canyon? How you became separated from your family?" Nalnish nodded solemnly. "My uncle and I were hunting rabbits 2 days from the reservation. A flash flood came down the arroyo where we had made camp. The water was very fast, very deep. It carried me away from him. I tried to swim, but the current was too strong. And then? I was thrown against rocks many times. When the water went down, I was far from home, in a place I did not know. I was hurt and lost. I walked for 2 days, looking for water, looking for people. But there was nothing. On the 3rd day, I could not walk anymore. The boy's account was delivered without dramatics, but the simple facts painted a picture of terror and desperation that moved even Agent Patterson to visible discomfort. Sergeant Hayes continued his questioning with professional thoroughness, but obvious sympathy. "How long were you in the canyon before Mr. McKenna found you?" "Almost 1 day. I was sleeping, I think. Or maybe unconscious. The sun was very hot, and I had no water. I thought I would die there." "And when he found you, what did he do?" "He gave me water. Very slowly so I would not be sick. He made shade for me. He stayed with me all that day and all that night, making sure I was safe. He built a bed for me and shared his blanket when it got cold." Thomas felt his throat tighten as the boy recounted those first desperate hours. Hearing it from Nalnish's perspective drove home just how close they had come to losing the child entirely. Agent Patterson struggled to maintain his suspicious stance. "But why didn't he take you straight to the reservation? Why did he continue toward the white settlements?" Elena answered before Nalnish could speak. "Because he did not know where we lived. Because my son was still too weak to travel hard. Because he was taking him to safety the only way he knew how." Carmen spoke urgently to Maria in Apache, pointing to marks in the dirt around the campfire. Maria translated, her voice carrying new weight. "Carmen has read all the sign around this camp and the place where Nalnish was found. She sees the story written in the earth. There was no capture, no force, no crime. Only rescue and care." Sergeant Hayes walked slowly around the camp, examining the evidence with the practiced eye of a man who had tracked everything from horse thieves to war parties. The layout of the camp, the arrangement of supplies, the obvious health of the boy, all of it told the same story. "Agent Patterson," he said finally, "I've seen kidnappings and worse on this frontier. This isn't one of them." But Patterson was not ready to let go of his suspicions. "Sergeant, I appreciate your military expertise, but I have administrative responsibilities here. This man has violated federal regulations by removing an Indian child from tribal lands without proper authorization." "What proper authorization?" Thomas spoke up, his voice sharp with controlled anger. "The boy was dying. Was I supposed to ride to the nearest federal office and fill out forms while he died of thirst? You should have taken him directly to the reservation." "I didn't know where the reservation was," Thomas shot back. "I've never been there. I was trying to get him to Copper Creek, where there's a doctor and people who might know how to contact his family." Maria Santos stepped forward again, her voice cutting through the argument with quiet authority. "Agent Patterson, you speak of regulations and proper procedures. Tell me, what regulation requires a man to let a child die rather than save his life?" The agent opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, clearly struggling to find an answer that would not make him sound heartless. Elena pressed the advantage. "My son was 3 days from death when this man found him. If he had followed your proper procedures, you would be investigating a dead child, not a living one. Which would you prefer?" Nalnish walked over to Thomas and took his hand, a gesture so natural and trusting that it spoke louder than any testimony. "He is my friend," the boy said simply. "He did not take me. He saved me." The soldiers shifted in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the investigation. These were frontier veterans who understood the difference between rescue and kidnapping, between compassion and crime. Their sergeant read their mood and made a decision. "Agent Patterson, sir, I think we have enough testimony to close this matter. No crime has been committed here, just the opposite. We've got a man who risked his own safety to save an Indian child's life. That used to count for something in this country." Patterson's face worked as he struggled between his bureaucratic instincts and the weight of evidence before him. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "Very well, Sergeant. But Mr. McKenna, I strongly advise you to report any future incidents involving reservation Indians to the proper authorities immediately. And I strongly advise you to remember that saving a child's life should never be considered a crime," Thomas replied quietly. The tension began to drain from the camp as the soldiers relaxed in their saddles. Sergeant Hayes approached Thomas and extended his hand. "Mr. McKenna, I want you to know that what you did here was right. Don't let any bureaucrat tell you otherwise." Thomas shook the offered hand, feeling some of the weight of the morning's stress lift from his shoulders. "Thank you, Sergeant. That means something, coming from a man like you." Agent Patterson gathered his reins with obvious reluctance. "This investigation is closed, but I'll be filing a full report with my superiors. Mr. McKenna, you would be wise to avoid such situations in the future." "Agent Patterson," Maria Santos called as he prepared to ride away, "when you write your report, you will include the fact that this white man showed more humanity than many of your federal agents. You will write that he treated an Apache child with the same care he would show his own son, and you will recommend that other white men learn from his example." The agent's face flushed again, but he nodded stiffly before spurring his horse toward the ridge. The soldiers followed in formation, leaving only dust clouds to mark their passage. In the silence that followed their departure, Thomas felt the full impact of what had just occurred. He had faced down federal investigation and military suspicion and emerged with his reputation intact. More importantly, the truth had prevailed over prejudice and bureaucracy. Maria Santos approached him with the expression of profound gratitude. "You stayed when you could have run. You faced their questions when you could have disappeared into the mountains. This shows a courage that my people will remember." Elena added her own thanks, tears glistening in her eyes. "You gave me back my son. There is no way to repay such a gift." Nalnish hugged Thomas around the waist, his young arms strong and warm. "Will I see you again?" he asked. Thomas knelt to the boy's level, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I hope so, son. I surely do hope so." Carmen spoke in Apache to Maria, who nodded thoughtfully before turning back to Thomas. "Carmen says she will tell the story of your kindness to all who will listen. She says it is important that our people know there are white men who see Apache children as simply children, not as enemies." The significance of this promise was not lost on Thomas. In a time and place where racial hatred ran deep on both sides, any gesture of understanding was precious beyond measure. As the day progressed and it became time for their paths to diverge, Maria Santos performed another ceremony. This one focused on Thomas. She painted symbols on his hands with clay mixed with sacred herbs, speaking words in ancient Apache that seemed to carry power beyond their literal meaning. "I mark you as friend to our people," she explained. "If you are ever in need, if you ever encounter Apache in your travels, you show them these marks. They will know you as the man who saved Nalnish. They will treat you as family." The gift was overwhelming in its implications. On the frontier, such a mark of acceptance could mean the difference between life and death for a traveling man. It represented trust that went far beyond the immediate gratitude for saving one child. Elena pressed a small beaded pouch into his hands. "Medicine bag," she said softly, "for protection on your travels. My son's spirit guardian will watch over you as you watched over him." As they prepared to part ways, Thomas realized that his life had been irrevocably changed by those few days. He had discovered reserves of courage and compassion within himself that he had not known existed. He had learned that doing the right thing sometimes meant facing consequences that seemed unfair or dangerous. Most importantly, he had learned that the barriers between peoples were often more fragile than they appeared. capable of being bridged by simple human decency. The Apache women and Nile-Nish rode toward the south, back to their reservation and their people. Thomas continued toward Copper Creek, carrying with him not just supplies for a trading post, but memories that would shape the rest of his days. In the months that followed, word of the incident spread throughout the territory. Among the white settlements, reactions were mixed. Some praised Thomas's humanity, while others questioned his judgment in helping an Apache child. But among the Apache, the story took on the weight of legend. The white man who had risked everything to save Nile-Nish became a symbol of what was possible when people chose compassion over suspicion. Thomas established his workshop in Copper Creek and built a reputation for honest dealing and fair treatment of all customers, regardless of their race or background. Apache traders began seeking him out, bringing work and commerce to his shop. They would show him small tokens, a feather, a piece of carved bone, a string of beads, that marked them as friends of the man who had saved Nile-Nish. Nile-Nish himself grew strong and healthy, becoming a bridge between his people and the white communities. He learned to speak perfect English and often served as a translator and negotiator, helping to prevent the misunderstandings that so often led to conflict. And always, in his adult years, he would tell the story of the white man who had stopped to help a dying Apache child, setting an example that others could follow. Years later, when Thomas was an old man with gray in his beard and lines around his eyes, he would look back on those 3 days in the desert as the most important of his life, not because of the gratitude he had earned or the respect he had gained, but because of a simple truth he had discovered. Sometimes the most profound acts of courage involve nothing more than stopping when others would ride past, listening when others would turn away, and choosing compassion when fear would be easier. The marks that Maria Santos had painted on his hands had long since faded, but the mark her grandson's rescue had left on his soul remained bright and clear for the rest of his days. In a hard country that often brought out the worst in people, Thomas McKenna had chosen to let it bring out his best, and that choice had changed not just one child's fate, but the understanding between two peoples who had too often seen each other as enemies rather than neighbors. In the end, the true measure of a man was not in the gold he accumulated or the property he owned, but in the moments when he chose mercy over convenience, courage over safety, and love over fear. Thomas McKenna had made that choice when it mattered most, and the reverberations of that decision would echo through generations of lives touched by his simple act of humanity.